Hello, welcome back. Today we are on Lesson 18, Chapter 18, which is using media queries and breakpoints. What we're going to learn in this lesson is how to write a CSS media query. We're going to learn how to use different media types. We're going to learn how to create media query expressions. We're going to talk about understanding logical keywords in our queries. We're going to talk about what CSS breakpoints are. We're going to talk about how to define breakpoints. And we're going to talk about how to find the best breakpoints for your website. So just before we move forward, let's make sure we understand what breakpoints are. Breakpoints are the points where media queries adjust the design. So even if you only have one breakpoint, your web page will respond to the presence of that breakpoint and respond appropriately to the user agents that match. So in this lesson, we're going to learn what breakpoints are and how to use them, plus what makes good breakpoints to support a wide variety of devices. The chapter starts off talking about what is a media query and how it is defined. And basically, a designer can use a media query to define an if-then statement based on the characteristics of the device it is viewing. So if the screen size is smaller than 600 pixels, do this, or do this. Or only do this up into the max size of 1200 pixels and then do something else. So you can use it to read what kind of device the user is looking at or what size the screen is, and then display some content accordingly. It talks about media types. There are 10 media types that you can test for with CSS media queries, and then it goes through and talks about using media features. There are 13 media features you can test for, and they're in your book. It gives you this really good table of 3 ways to add media queries. You can use the media attribute on a link to define media queries as the style sheet is loaded. That's one way. The second way is you can include the media type in the import command to define media queries when a style sheet is imported. And then the third way is to include media-specific styles directly in another style sheet to limit the scope of the enclosed styles. And this third way is probably what you've seen in any previous examples that I used for lessons. I did use media queries to show you some responsive web design, even though we didn't talk about them yet. Another thing we can do with media queries are using media query expressions. So in order to actually use media queries effectively, we need to know how to write expressions. So we learned the 3 basic expressions to target browsers above a certain minimum width, or to target browsers below a certain maximum width, and to target browsers that fall between a minimum width and maximum width. But we can also create much more complicated expressions. Media query expressions use logical operators to define complex scenarios, and these are the operators that we can use. We can use and, or, and not. So the and combines features and types together and will match if all the elements are present. When I said or, it's a list. It's a list separated by commas. And in a comma-separated list of features or types, if any of them are true, the query will match. And then not, this negates the entire query, and the query will match if the query would normally return false. So we talked about breakpoints. A breakpoint is a device feature with a media query declaration assigned to it. Most designers do think of breakpoints as places where the width of the design changes to accommodate different devices. Most responsive designs have at least one breakpoint that changes the look of the design when that breakpoint is reached. You should also know when making breakpoints, if you're going to have like 15 or 20 breakpoints in your code, you will have to account for all of them in adding more style. So for each breakpoint, you have to add one reversion of page style. So you have to style the page even if you have no breakpoints. But when you add 15 breakpoints, you have to have 15 other versions of the page, and so on. So only use a breakpoint when it's necessary to change the design. Don't just add them for the sake of adding them. You define breakpoints in your media queries. And like I said, the most common type of breakpoint is based on the width of the device. Your book gives you an example of a page with 2 breakpoints. And what it does is it changes the color of the text once the screen reaches a certain threshold. So when the screen is really small, the text is blue, red for medium-sized screen, and then the text gets green for a really large screen. So you can actually try that example that's in your book and resize your browser window, and you'll see when it's really small it'll be blue, and then it will turn to red and then green based on the size of the window. So you can try that and play around with that so you understand how that works and get comfortable with that. Another thing we should know is that You should define styles that remain the same for every device first. When you're writing a style sheet for a responsive website, the first styles you want to define are ones that are the same no matter what device views them. So typically it's something like the colors, the font families, the background images. Usually these don't change regarding the device size, so you want to define them first and get them done right away. It's certainly possible that you can have different colors and font families depending on the device, but most websites like to keep it consistent. And keeping things the same, you reassure your customers that they're on the same page no matter what device they're using. You don't want it to look different if they're on their phone based on if they're on their computer. Your book gives you a really good example of some initial styles for a web page. It goes through on some initial styles to start with, and then it goes through and shows you how you can add styles for smaller screens, and then it goes through how you can add styles for medium-sized devices and then larger-sized devices. And then towards the end, it talks about optimal breakpoints. Where's the best point to put a breakpoint and why you would put a breakpoint in a certain place. So that really depends on your customers and your design. Like we said, you can use widths of popular devices to come up with a breakpoint. So we know that an iPhone is this width and an iPad is this width, so you can do that. But it's best to view your site at different widths and just see where your site breaks. So you can use responsive design mode to slowly resize the window until the design breaks, and then once the design is broken or the page is hard to read or things just look wrong, then you can add a breakpoint there. So a best practice for adding a breakpoint would be choose breakpoints for the design, not the device. Meaning it's tempting to just be like, well, I know iPads are this size, so I'm going to do this, set a minimum width of, say, 720 pixels because that's the iPhone 5. But really, it's better to use a width based on where your design starts getting difficult to read or use, catered to your design specifically. You want to keep breakpoints 1 pixels different. So when you use more than one breakpoint, make sure that the second one is exactly 1 pixels wider than the first one. So if you have a breakpoint at 500 pixels, the next one should be 501. And you want to consider the device orientation, not just width. And you don't want to forget about Retina devices. Retina devices and other high pixel density devices can look bad if your images aren't optimized for them. So coming up next, I'm going to share my screen with you and we'll go over some examples that we learned in this lesson. So this example in your book has a page with 2 breakpoints. We're saying the color of the text is blue if the width is less than 480 pixels. So we're saying this media query, if the minimum width is 480 pixels, and the maximum width is 700 pixels. So that means if the width is in between, meaning greater than or equal to 480 pixels and less than or equal to 700 pixels, then the color is going to be red. And if it's greater than 700 pixels, the color is going to be green. We can use our inspector. If I right-click, click inspect, that's what will get me this screen right here. And we can actually see what's happening. So I'm going to resize this to the smallest. So we notice that less than 480 pixels is going to be blue. And we can see here that, notice the CSS box model right here. Anyway, the body color is blue. So when I resize this and I get to 480, so it's at 430, moving up. Now it's 492 over 480. It turns red, and this is red, and we notice this gets crossed out because it's not using that. That's a break. And then when we get large enough, it should turn green. Now it's over 700, so now it's green. And that's what we see that right here. So these are how to set breakpoints with media queries to change content and styling based on the width of a device. So this is the initial style sheet from your book. This is a really good baseline. You start off, you set color for your background, text color, headings, and you defined a standard font family for your headlines. Gives the document black text, white background. Gives a background image for the header. And it's just a really good start. And then here's some mobile specific stuff that you can add. says the width of every content element should be 100% to fill the screen of mobile devices. It means you'll have one column for the content. And list, especially list of links, should have a lot of space between list items to make them easy to read and click, which is why this is good for mobile devices. And then it adds some media queries for larger devices with styles, and then you can add styles specific to those breakpoints. Well, I hope those examples helped. Coming up next, we have our Lesson 18 PowerPoint presentation, so stay tuned.